time for Type 40. We're your Doctor Who podcast on the Fandom Podcast Network. On this show, we take an in-depth and closer look at this beloved television series, the spin-offs, the merchandise, even the fandom itself. Doctor Who's gone from homegrown family favourite to international entertainment legend and shaped the landscape of science fiction and fantasy for well over 5 decades. Now step into our TARDIS and share this particularly wicked journey together here with us on Type 40. Hello. Yes, here we are again, back at it with our Blu Ray players spinning and our mouths running about classic Doctor Who. Whatever season we're talking about, it's always somebody's happy place. I'm Dan Hadley, I'm your regular Type 40 pilot. I'm Birmingham's king of the geeks. And that's entirely the doing of Doctor Who, really. I'm a lifelong fan. It could be that you are too, but if you're not, well, you know, you're fine with us too. There's no gatekeeping, only conversation, fun and games, and yeah, maybe this time there could be a little leftover angst from the very end of the classic series with me, my friends and fellow fans here. The first of which is he's our very own Blu Ray of Sunshine, TV industry professional and the original Hoonatic, Mr. Simon Horton. How's your box set shelf looking this week?
Oh, Dan, it's beginning to it's beginning to strain under the weight of these box sets that keep arriving now. As long as they keep on coming along, I'm very, very happy, man. You know I love these box sets.
That's it. Thick and fast, but not too fast. We don't want them to rush, do we? We should stress that.
No. We want them to take their time and pace them out. And I think given coronavirus, they will definitely be pacing them out now. Unfortunately, they're going to get thinner and fewer and further between, I think, unfortunately. But whatever, love them.
It could be right. More and more time to pick our way through the features, isn't it? And make sure we've got it all covered and all nailed down before the next lot arrives. Now, long-time listeners may know that for each of these regular Blu-ray deep dives that we do, we like to invite somebody else in to take the other chair, the third chair, somebody with a specific affinity, a love for the era in question. And this time there's no exception. Making his first proper full appearance on Type 40 at long last after me pestering him for God knows how long, it's freelance journalist Jonathan Melville.
Hi Dan, hi Simon, how you doing?
Hi, Jonathan. It's nice to have you on board.
Thanks for having me. It's been, Dan has been hassling me a little bit, in a nice way. But it's a nice hassling. It's a nice thing to be hassled about. So thank you.
It was either come on or the other restraining order, wasn't it? Really?
That was it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. You are a freelance journalist. Like you've had articles and things like SFX and what have you. But where will people have seen your name the most?
I suppose the biggest one really is a book that I brought out a few years ago as a fan of the Tremors films. I decided to write a book on them. And certainly the first 4 films in the TV series, which is what were available when I wrote the book, started the book.
They're romps, I suppose, aren't they?
They're romps, and they don't take themselves too seriously. There's a bit, tongue-in-cheek. They're sort of horror films, but they're not horrible horror films. They're fun.
And was Doctor Who your sort of gateway into this genre as well?
Pretty much it was, yes. Back in the 80s, I suppose, is when I really got into Doctor Who. I will make an admission, which I don't know if this will get me chucked off before it starts. In the earlier 80s, I was kind of watching ITV more. So Saturday, I was watching things like the A-Team on ITV. I know. I can see Simon is. I was young. I was foolish. I was sort of, what would I have been? Born in '76, so I would have been kind of 7 or 8 when these things were on.
Tempted by the fruits of Buck Rogers and various other things.
Yeah, obviously I came to my senses and realised that this thing on BBC One. I don't know if we'll talk about this more, but I got into Doctor Who at both a brilliant time and a terrible time because it was season 24 is when I kind of discovered it properly. For some reason, I don't even really know what was going on. I think it was probably around the 25th anniversary celebrations that were, I guess, magazines and things were starting to cover Doctor Who a little bit more because of that. I think I knew a bit about Doctor Who. I definitely knew about Doctor Who and I knew about Colin Baker. But for some reason, it was just this time it all just started to appeal to me a little bit more. And then, of course, it got cancelled just as I was getting into it. So I then had the Wilderness years. So it was an interesting time to become a fan.
But you did have, this was the very first, wasn't it, of the Scottish Doctors. That must have held a certain appeal for you as well.
I think it probably did. Probably something quite nice about that and hearing the Scottish accent on the telly. So, yeah. And even just thinking about it while watching these episodes again, you think, just a few years earlier, it had been, everyone was raving about Doctor Who. Well, I say everybody, but there was a lot in the press, certainly, in books and magazines.
It fell from favour really quite quickly, didn't it? And I think rather a hangover from Michael Grade so publicly, when somebody right at the very top so publicly loses faith in something and pushes it so far away, there was an aroma of failure about it. And the reason why it wouldn't go away, it wasn't just because of fans, even though that legend would probably have you believe that. It's because the general public want to watch Doctor Who. They do, just then as they do now. They want it to be there. We're always fighting probably general audience complacency a little with Doctor Who. That's not an ideal situation to be in. I think it's something that the programme makers, they flirt with that at their peril. They risk, the risk in that is very, very dangerous. But it wasn't a wounded animal by the time we come to talk about it. Certainly now, by the time of season 26, it may have adjusted its expectations of itself, but it was starting to become, and the people at the top of it were very aware of the place that it was in. Even if they were perhaps being given short shift, they were playing the hand that was dealt. Because they were probably the right people at the right time, we got something that's really quite exciting to talk about. Before we get stuck in too deeply into that, I'm off already. We've got to go and check in with some of those the Fandom Podcast Network's fixed points that we must remind our listeners of. Each and every edition of our show, past, present and future, is up on the Fandom Podcast Network's own master feed at fpnet.podbean.com and fpnet on the Podbean app. Fandom Podcast Network goodness is also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play and iHeartRadio. You can stream or download us there, and wherever you're listening in from, you can let us know what you think through all our social media presence. Instagram and Twitter, type 40 Doctor Who, or get some daily Doctor Who goodness with our wonderful companions of all ages across all relative dimensions in Type 40's own lively Facebook group, and there's links to all of that in the show notes. Simon, you've got your own sort of long-standing haunt, haven't you? Happily, it's not under a lake. It's a lot easier to find. Where can people look you up on Facebook?
Search for Doctor Who, The Hoonatics. You'll come and find me there. The group's been running since, 1987, actually. So it started right bang in the middle of the era that we're currently talking about. So, yeah, come and say hello on at The Hoonatics, where I'm one of the admins.
Yeah, Zuckerberg's got nothing on you, has he?
Absolutely. Telling me, I did actually have somebody at one point say to me, how can your group have been going since 1987, since Facebook only started? And I'm like, do you know what? Facebook wasn't even, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg was even born when we started The Hoonatics.
It's quite likely. Jonathan, have you got a website where people can order books or pre-order or do whatever?
Just jonathanmelville.co.uk. That's JONATHAN. Melville. I want to spell Melville. .co.uk. Yeah, or I'm on Twitter, John JON_Melville.
There's no fat on that, is there?
No.
Good stuff. And I'm scattered through all the space at the time, quite naturally, though mostly on Instagram and Twitter as the Spacebook, where I talk about all things geeky in movies, TV, comics, and whatever else catches my eye, my imagination, or both in popular culture. Doctor Who's long history has been far from a steady ride. We've touched on it already. And there have been ups and downs, highs and lows, and several, unmovable fixed points of their own, really, I suppose. 1989, specifically the autumn of 1989, is perhaps the most conflicting of them all. Just as you were saying, Jonathan, because the series, this was the final season of the classic run. Doctor Who had begun in 1963, as we all know, and continued almost seamlessly since, but it was all about to conclude. And we had no real clear idea why and when, what was going on, and if we'd ever see the TARDIS again, really. The series had quite recently risen from the ashes of actual cancellation and reinvented itself, and Sylvester McCoy's seventh Doctor was beginning this third season, well established in this early evening weekday time slot opposite Coronation Street, but it sort of made it its own in a funny sense. Yeah, one thing we'd like to do on these shows, Jonathan, is we'd like to lower ourselves back through time. If you can imagine, not just the Coronation Street theme tune, if you're trying to turn it over for if your nan was watching or whatever, but we like to think about some of the music and some of the sounds that were passing between our ears, and they could have been on Ace's boombox, couldn't they, in 1989? So have a listen to this little lot and see if any of them jog any memories. Very first big number one of autumn 1989 was Black Box with Ride on Time, which is a big Italian dance anthem. It was number one for 6 weeks. And it's considered to be a bit of a classic in its field. Simon, you're scrunching your face. So it's not.
Yeah,
not,
I am.
Not
I think that was 6 weeks too many, as far as I'm concerned, at number one. But it's what amazes me with that particular song is it's been around so long, and yet it, as much as I don't like it, it still feels very, very fresh. And you still hear it today, and it doesn't sound as though it's. I have to be honest. I'm surprised. It was 1980, 89 that it was released, and that's amazed me.
It's aged well, I think, and she does sound like she probably needed a throat sweet or two after recording that.
Yeah, she throws her all into it, doesn't she? Let's say that.
From one extreme to the other here, because that record, that black box record, was sandwiched between 2 hits by Jive Bunny and the Master Mixers. If you remember these guys, they used to peddle sort of medleys of old tracks from the 50s and the 60s, sort of jam them all together and sort of remix them and introduce stutters, didn't they? Do you remember that, Jonathan? Do you still have waking nightmares about that?
Yeah. I've been watching the Top of the Pops repeats for the last few years. So
they've just reached 89. At the moment
we're in 1989, and it's pretty abysmal actually so far. There's a lot of fast forwarding goes on in some of these songs. I think Jason Donovan was at number one, the last one I watched from a few weeks ago.
That's a bit more.
There's a lot of Sonia in there as well. I'm with you on this, Jonathan. I've been watching those Top of the Pops for a long time now, and yes, they are just ironically right back. It's slap bang in the middle of 1989 at the moment.
Yeah.
And there's I likewise I fast forward through and it lasts about 2 minutes at the moment. I think pop music had reached its nadir at this point, to be honest.
It was starting to all seem the same, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think we needed a new decade to come along and sort of freshen things up a bit.
I'm not sure Ace would have had any of that on her boombox, but maybe this one, All Around the World by Lisa Stansfield. This was a big number one. I think she had quite a big career after this as well, but somehow she never had a record as big as this one. Lisa Stansfield, a big talent, wasn't she, Simon?
What was surprising about Lisa Stansfield, of course, is that we all kind of thought she was American until she started doing interviews, and then we discovered where was she from? She was from Manchester, Rotherham, cracking accent, and it was just really strange because nobody expected her to sound like that, given how she sounded on All Around the World.
Help was at hand from America, funnily enough, with New Kids on the Block. They had their first UK hit at this time.
What did I say? That it was the nadir of pop music? Was it?
Well, they thought they got the right stuff, and all their fans did, because You Got the Right Stuff. That was number one from them. I never particularly liked that one either. I must confess. I don't think it was aimed at me, Jonathan. I got to be honest.
No, I was never really a fan. No.
But there were some big albums at the time which were a little bit more up my street. Erasure's album Wild. They were huge at the time. I think they hadn't even hit their peak. But this is the one that's got Drama, Star, Blue Savannah. Yeah, some big hits for them on there. And there was Kylie Minogue's second album, Enjoy Yourself, with those belters, Hand on Your Heart. Simon's got his head in his hands at Hand on Your Heart, and Never Too Late. They were both on there. You're not a Kylie fan then, Simon?
No, afraid not. But I've got an interesting story about Kylie, actually, because I have a very, very, very tentative link to Kylie. Back in the mid-'80s, you're going to like this one. You're not going to have a clue where this one's going. Back in the mid-'80s, I got to be mates with one William Baker, who was a Doctor Who fan, and I met him at Fan Aid in 1985 in Bath, which was a Doctor Who convention organised by Paul Cornell. And but we just struck up a friendship and got chatting and ended up doing a fanzine. It was the first time I dipped my toe into fanzines, a Doctor Who fanzine called Sentinel. It only ever ran to one issue. But I did that with William Baker and lost touch with him after that and hadn't got a clue what happened to him. Then years later, I happened to see him being interviewed on television at one point. He was Kylie Minogue's creative guru. Wrote loads of books with Kylie, organised all those massive, huge tours, was responsible for sort of Cybermen being on stage with Kylie and on numerous of her tours. It now is still, I think, this kind of mega star within the sort of the creative world. So if you're out there listening, William, yeah, I do remember you out there. So that's my tentative link to Kylie.
And Jonathan, were any of those on your, whatever you call it, your Walkman or anything else at the time?
I remember coming home from school and watching Neighbours every lunchtime. So I suppose Kylie was, at the time, I probably thought
she'd made your
Kylie
radar.
was quite good, yeah. But she's iconic, isn't she? And of course, she's a Doctor Who connection as well now.
I think she's a bit of an icon. I'm a fan with a small f. I told you I was twisting my words.
Yeah, I think I like the way she sort of reimagined some of her songs in the sort of noughties.
Yeah.
kind of less Poppy, less Stockman and and Waterman.
Well, around this time, I just started college. I just started doing my A-levels, and life was sort of getting a bit bigger and a bit broader. And I discovered, funny enough, Simon, organised Doctor Who fandom. First with a little group, not that far from where I live, but within a few months, I was brought into contact with the Hoonatics, and I met you. I met you for the very, very first time, because you were right at the head of that. You're the organiser and the originator of the Hoonatics.
Yeah.
I haven't looked back since.
Careful what you say. I would say you and I probably met in this very year, probably in 1989, I would reckon, which is the year we're talking about today. So I'm reckoning, you and I probably go back to this very year.
Very vivid memories, very happy times for me. Up until that point, I hadn't really spent much time with other Doctor Who fans. It'd been something I'd sort of annoyed other people with, and they just look at me with that sort of blank expression that we sometimes get. But yeah, just reading through some of those titles for the old tunes. It's the same when you watch those Top of the Pops on BBC4. They do transport you back, and even though we've sort of revisited these Doctor Who stories time after time after time in the years in between, they've kind of got a life of their own. When you sit them back against what the contemporary stuff was, in context, you can see that Doctor Who always did stand out. Earlier this year, after the usual sort of false start and missed release date, BBC Studios added season 26 to the Doctor Who collection Blu Ray box set line. It says in 1989, Doctor Who was on a creative high. The Seventh Doctor and his companion Ace revitalising the programme for a new generation. Season 26 featured 4 epic adventures traversing a future Britain invaded by interdimensional knights, a strange Victorian house haunted by ghosts from Ace's past, an alien world populated by cheetah people, and a 1940s army camp under siege from monstrous vampires. It's another beautifully packaged box set. So then matches those 14 episodes, now upscaled with masses of extras, new VAM as they say, to make up this 7-disc release. Season 26 opened with several bangs and a great big boom in Battlefield. That's Ben Aranovic's second 4-part story. Arthurian sort of action here. Mark Platt's notorious spooky 3-parter Ghostlight followed. Simon, we've had several discussions about that already, but no doubt get into that in a moment. The Curse of Fenric was by Ian Briggs, of course. That was another 4-parter. And making up the remaining 3 was Rona Munro's curious, spiritual, and some would say prescient story, Survival. Revisiting these episodes as an experience, it has taken on other contexts, and there's been so many shifts in the fortunes of the whole franchise, the whole Doctor Who brand, ever since. Before this point, we'd had umbrella themes before, hadn't we, Jonathan? We'd had the Key to Time, the Trial of a Time Lord. As I view it, this is the first example of arc storytelling.
Oh, it sounds pretty much spot on to me, yeah. I think Andrew Cartmel had some amazing ideas for the series, and finally had a chance to sort of plan something out, didn't he, and plot something. And work with the writers. Work with the writers to try and...
Because it was a writer's room, wasn't it, by modern standards?
Yes.
I think he got Ben Aranovich working very closely with him. I think there was a view that Ben Aranovich would maybe succeed him in the script editor's role, but they'd been planning it before as well, because obviously Andrew Cartmel had taken the reins in season 24, albeit not quite from the very, very start. And even though the Ace character didn't obviously materialise for a little while, we started to see it with season 25, and here I think when they knew they were a bit more secure in the fact that they had got extra episodes to play with, they started to chart an arc for Ace, but by reflection for the Doctor too, as much as a character like Tom Baker always says that the Doctor can't ever really evolve, can't ever really change. I don't know if that's true. I think he can up to a point, but there's always a bit of a reset button with the Doctor through how the relationship between the two of them here, and how he responds to the questions that she asks and what she specifically needs. That's what drives this arc. Although they intended to continue it after this point, this is the meat and potatoes of it, isn't it? It's personal, I would say.
And I think what's particularly interesting with this is that of course, to a large extent, the whole Ace line story arc comes about purely because they saw the strength of Sophie Aldred's performance, and so to a large extent, that whole Ace story arc is down purely to Sophie Aldred, because if they hadn't been as impressed as they were by her, they probably would never have pushed and developed it. But they realised that she was a strong performer. They realised that her and Sylvester were working very well as a double act, and they could thus see that they could push it much further. And that, I think, as I say, it wasn't planned when the Ace character was planned. They didn't plan to do the story arc that we ultimately get in season 26. And so, as I say, it's a credit to Sophie that it's purely down to her that it all came about, really.
Because they used the expression there in that blurb, and revitalising the series for a new generation, which could be hyperbole. Because it didn't, at that point, Doctor Who wasn't what you would call relevant as in how it has been in the 21st century and how it had been before, but on its own terms. It was sturdy again, wasn't it? And I think it's because those two actors were working closely together. They had clear ideas of who their characters were. They were doing enough to grow them in the audience's minds. You imagined adventures that had gone on in between the adventures that we saw, and you could see the bond between them growing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it feels to me like Remembrance of the Daleks. It feels to me like that was potentially the point where maybe they realised that they had something really special. Just everything seemed to come together for that story. And yeah, just their partnership just was so natural. And I think because they were probably friends off set as well as on set, I think that definitely brought an extra dimension to it as well. And when they had that banter, you kind of it just felt a bit more real.
I always liked the Professor and all that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of fans really set their teeth on edge, didn't they? But I always quite liked it, and I think that they played it well, and they knew when to pick it up and when to put it down. Okay, it's not what you call sophisticated characterisation, but again, it is very, very consistent. And the model that had worked, or what had worked at season 25, because I don't think that was 100% successful, but the things that had worked, I think they carried it through quite nicely to season 26, starting out with Battlefield, which, just like Remembrance of the Daleks, there's lots of running around, there's lots and lots of action. It's again written by Ben Aranovich. He seems to be able to handle the big stuff and be able to write on a really personal level too. So just like we had the scene in the cafeteria, didn't we, in Remembrance, we got other scenes in the little pub in Battlefield. He takes as much care with the smaller characters and the tiny moments as all the sort of allegory to nuclear threat. Starting with Battlefield, Jonathan, how successful do you think that story was starting out the season?
I think there are... I enjoyed it, watching it again. At the time, I think I was a little bit disappointed by some of what felt a little bit, maybe the effects were not as good as I maybe wanted them to be at the time. They were very ambitious, and that's something that you have to applaud them for. And I think looking back on it, I'm more impressed now almost than I was at the time, just because of watching the set as a whole and seeing what they were working with. And budgets and
the budget had gone down on this season, from what I remember.
Yeah, and the pressures. I mean, sorry, just jumping slightly to Fenric. They talked about they had, I think it was 12 or 13 days to do basically almost a feature film. It's incredible. So, but going back to Battlefield, I mean, I love the fact that the Brigadier was back and we had the new Brigadier, but it still felt a little bit stagey. I think at the time, a little bit. There's this just weird thing, just when you were talking about this new generation and talking about Sophie as well. Much as I love Sophie and I've met her many times and she's a lovely person, I think she's not a girl from the East End of London, or she's not the sort of chirpy.
She's not as authentic as Billy Piper was as Rose Tyler in comparison. So.
Exactly, and I think that is the interesting thing. Looking back at that, people talk a lot about this Survival in particular being this sort of bridge to the new series. And at the time, I don't think in 1989 you would have been able to get Billy Piper or someone like that with authentic then. So it's still this strange show which is set in, it's like a BBC drama of the time, family drama, let's say, that is wanting to be something slightly different, slightly darker maybe. And I think it's doing really well. And by the time they get to something like Fenric or even Ghostlight, they are doing well, but it's just it's still being held back a little bit by the maybe season 24. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but it's just this: they just couldn't quite get to where they wanted to be, where they would be in 15 years' time, because just the way the BBC worked and the way BBC drama worked, they just wouldn't allow them to have that. So
But it wasn't a hole. It wasn't a hole that they dug for themselves. It was a hole that the BBC had put them in, Simon. We've spoken about this before, and to their credit, between them, the production team and the regular cast, they were trying to claw out of it, weren't they, and get their foot in and move on. You haven't watched these stories for a long time until recently, have you?
I have to be honest, I literally haven't seen any of these stories since transmission because season 26 didn't set my world on fire. I thought there was an enormous amount to commend in it, and it was huge leaps forward from season 24. And it's interesting that Jonathan brings season 24 in, because I actually agree. I think Battlefield looks like it belongs in season 24. The other three stories from season 26 are of one style and absolutely fit together beautifully. Battlefield is the anomaly that it should in effect have been the last story of season 24 and would have worked a lot better as a result somehow, because it just doesn't fit in that well with the style of where the show was going in season 26. And for me, Battlefield is by far and away the weakest of the stories in season 26. And it's interesting again, Dan, that you bring in Ben Aronovich and the comparison with Remembrance of the Daleks, because to me there's a gulf between Remembrance of the Daleks and Battlefield, whereas Remembrance feels very, you're right in all that you identify about what Ben Aronovich did well in Remembrance of the Daleks, and that's spot on. He tries to do exactly the same thing again in Battlefield, but for me, it just doesn't come off. It doesn't gel. It doesn't work as a whole. There are major faults with it. Ben Aronovich himself speaks about this on the Blu Ray disc, that he was not happy with the ultimate realization of the story. He very generously takes this upon himself and takes responsibility for the failure, if there is one in inverted commas, for Battlefield. He takes that entirely on his own shoulders and says it was down to him and the writing. I disagree. I think it's partially the writing, but I really think partially it's also the production as well. It just doesn't quite work. Jonathan's correct. They try very ambitious special effects, some of which come off, some of which end up just looking like very, very cheap BBC effects, that they would have been better to go for something slightly less dramatic and impressive, and they would have pulled it off.
See, I loved them at the time, of the sort of Quantel style effects, like the snake-headed sort of laser creature and things like that. I loved all that at the time, but of course it hasn't aged particularly well. Most Doctor Who effects, they don't. But at the time, the methods they were using, like CSO in the early 70s, this was cutting edge stuff, wasn't it? And they were pretty much just sort of playing, really. The whole script is a little too sprawling. There's too many members. There's too many cast members there doing too little that sort of dilutes it a bit. But I would blame the bulk of its failure in inverted commas on the direction. I just don't think that Andrew Kerrigan's anywhere near the steady hand that Andrew Morgan was on Remembrance, and even on Time and the Riley, to be fair to him, because obviously the direction on that was strong. He would have, I'm certain, have brought more mood to Battlefield, because there was some studio work and location.
It feels very much like children's BBC production to me, Battlefield. It feels like something that would be on children's BBC.
I think Andrew Kerrigan had done a lot of children's TV, come to think of it, on ITV.
That's how it feels. I actually think that also one of the problems, and this is a problem for me throughout season 26, is the fact that everything is done on video, and that video look very much cheapens it. Unfortunately, that outside broadcast video look for everything in season 26. It just makes it look quite cheap, and especially once you get jumping ahead a bit to something like Curse of Fenric, that would have been so much better if the location had been shot on film. So I don't think it does it any favours by shooting it all on video, but I realise the reasons for doing that.
The way that it's balanced, obviously they lean heavy, don't they, with allegories to the nuclear threat, particularly with the character of the Destroyer, don't they? The stomping around, will they, won't they, sort of press that button and all that sort of thing. It's got power to it, hasn't it? Somehow, with all the running around, I wouldn't label this as panto as such. it all does feel a little naff, and like it's a bunch of people sort of having a couple of fun days out. When you get to some of the location stuff, that's probably where that all falls down. But there is plenty of stuff that I do like about it. I think there's some nice work between Sophie and Sylvester in particular, come to think of it. But with Nick Courtney, some of the locations that they choose, I think they're like nothing I'd really seen on television at that point. But you could mistake that for an actual dig.
Yeah.
And I think that did continue with The Curse of Fenric. You talked about that a moment ago. Nick Mallet, that was his decision to shoot all of that on location, from what I remember. And I think because J&T had offered him studio sessions and he said no. Jonathan, how do you feel it compares to The Curse of Fenric?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just going to say there, actually, I think the fact that everything, okay, apart from Ghostlight, everything else was on location, I think that really works well for this season. Just really nice to see those places, and then on the Blu-ray to watch the comparisons with those places now, actually. But no, I think it looked good, and I think the sort of the base around the lake where they were based was really nice, and yeah, the dig was impressive. It's just that definitely there's that children's TV feel to the effects, and I think there is a really nice story buried in there. This idea of the Doctor's future. The Doctor sort of trying to come to terms with what he's done in the future and work it all out. It's a really nice idea, and Merlin I think is fantastic. That concept is brilliant. But yes, it does get lost in Space Knights things.
Well, I think this is one of my main problems with Battlefield as a whole. Is I still don't actually get what the story is about. What are these knights? Where have they come from? Who is Anselin? How does he relate to anything? For no apparently good reason, Morgaine in the fourth episode or is it the third episode, just summons up the Destroyer. Who is he? Where has he come from? What relationship has he got with Morgaine? So it all feels like a lot of brilliant ideas all swirling around in this pot. But that's why I say that it doesn't feel that it quite comes together as a cohesive whole. I don't get it.
I think a lot of that and a lot of the problems with Doctor Who at this time, if it had problems, and it's sort of the opposite of that which we're getting now in 2020, is that there's not enough exposition. That a lot of this is mentioned in the odd bit of dialogue here and there. If you've been listening to whoever's on the sofa next to you, or something has distracted you for just a moment, you could have missed that key bit of dialogue where something like that was explained about people, beings from other dimensions, from across sidewards in time, and all this sort of thing. Brilliant idea, but if you've missed that very sort of slight mention, then you are kind of lost, really, because they never do anything with it. What you were talking about a moment ago, Jonathan, the concept of that blew my mind when I was a teenager. We'd seen the Doctor's past get talked about, either direct sequels to stuff we'd seen or sequels to stuff we hadn't seen, like in Time Lash. But the idea that this was something to do with something the Doctor was going to do in the future, maybe, and assume other identities, the romance of it, the things that I'd come to love about Doctor Who at this point, that it had been going on for so long, and it had its own lore, and that this character is a sort of a standard, he's a Sherlock Holmes type, he's a Peter Pan type, he's bigger than that. That had real power for me. Every time I watch the story again, I am surprised by how bold they were with it in 1989.
Well, it's fascinating as well, just watching Fenric, which I've done again in the last few days, and thinking that this whole, what would you call it, just the Doctor's involvement with Fenric has been going on off screen for centuries, and as viewers we've never seen it or even heard of it, and then suddenly we're just dropped into the middle of this, or the end of this story that he's had somewhere else, and you just sort of go, oh, this was Wednesday night, which we haven't talked about, even just where it was showing at the time, Wednesday nights opposite Coronation Street in the UK, and you've suddenly got adventures that have been taking place in other centuries. In Battlefield, you've got parallel dimensions of the Doctor, and we just sort of think we're watching this kind of, okay, bit crazy, but relatively straightforward, I suppose, adventure story.
Yeah, it had always been so analogue in the past. That's the thing.
That's amazing that they were doing that, and we were all just going, oh, okay, I thought this was just about a battlefield now, but actually this is tying into another universe that we're never really going to find out anything else about. So in a way, I suppose we could maybe say they were treating the audience with a lot more intelligence than a lot of other programs at the time, you know.
Well, you're spot on there, Jonathan. And actually, I mean, this was a conscious decision on Andrew Cartmell's part to not spoon feed the audience, and so that was all very deliberate. And so I would applaud that. But I think Dan's right. I think you've also got to be careful that you've still got to give the audience sufficient that they pick up. So as I say, I'm still left in this limbo.
Yeah.
I don't even know why the knights were on Earth, for example. What they seem to be having this fight that has started another dimension. Why had they even ended up on Earth in the first place? I think there's some fantastic ideas cooking along there, and a little bit of extra exposition would just have cemented them in the narrative, and thus it would have become more effective as a whole.
I did hear talk that Ben Aronovich wanted, ideally, I think that Battlefield would be a three-parter, and it was increased.
It was originally a three-parter. It was originally a three-parter, and this, interestingly, again, is what Ben talks about on the Blu Ray box set, is how he admits he made a fundamental error because it was written as a three-parter. Cartmell asked him then to make it up to a four-parter, and instead of starting from the beginning and rewriting it from scratch as a four-parter, he literally just kind of fudged and expanded out episode 3 into 2 parts, and so that's why he felt that ultimately it didn't hang together. And as I say, I think he's very generous that he takes that on the chin and admits that it was an error in not rewriting it from scratch as a 4-parter.
You have to take stock of the fact that everybody on the writing staff, Ben Aronovich, I think he was probably the oldest one of the writers on there, and he was only about 26, something like that. Everybody else, Andrew Cartmell himself, he was certainly only about 26, 27. Who else was there? Was Ian Briggs. I know very little about Ian Briggs.
They're all about that age. You're quite right, Dan.
Same with Rona Munro. You know, they were firebrands in a sense, but there were people that maybe hadn't found their voice, hadn't got every tool in their bag that ultimately that writers do get after they've been in a craft. But JNT was quite hands-off. Big change around in quite a short period of time, really. I think some of that was perhaps self-preservation. I'm not saying he wasn't interested, but I think he obviously had great faith in Cartmell, and Cartmell had faith in them. And in some ways, I think the show had got nothing left to lose, Simon, really.
That's true, and certainly, yes, John Nathan Turner at this point was very hands-off compared with how he'd been in season 18, for example, where he's very, very hands-on. And to a large extent, I think that was because he was dealing with so much behind the scenes, just desperately trying to keep the show alive, and keep the BBC bosses off the backs of everybody else. I think he was just desperate to get a show on television. It was very much a scramble to get it done, and so he was happy to leave it to Cartmell. And I think Cartmell, you're right, Cartmell was absolutely the right person for the right job at the right time, I think. But to an extent, I think he was probably finding his feet as much as the writers themselves were finding their feet. So whereas you might have had, for example, in the days when Robert Holmes was the script editor and was a very, very well-established, he had his craft by then, Cartmell was learning on his feet as well. Which is no bad thing. That's not a criticism of Andrew Cartmell at all. It's that's how it was, and so some of that then comes out in the writing style that maybe some things are missed that, for example, Robert Holmes wouldn't have missed.
Talk about budget and talk about the breakup or the breakdown of the plot. Looking at Battlefield and the fact that he wanted that to be a 3-parter. There was talk that Ghostlight in its original form was going to be a 4-part, that the story was way too big for the 3 episodes that had got. So I wouldn't say it was that nobody knew what they were doing, but if things were sort of bolted down a bit better. All of these stories had masses of extra material. Yeah, in all but the case of Survival, masses of footage that was actually filmed and never used. They'd all gone through multiple working titles. Things like that don't do the finished product any harm, but it does sort of imply this more sort of frenetic, creative process, maybe where the tone would shift and the content would change. The running order would change too. I think Battlefield was filmed first, Curse of Fenric was filmed second, then Survival, with Ghost last. No, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, no. Originally, Battlefield was due to be filmed first, followed by Curse of Fenric, but then they reversed it because of Nick Courtney's availability. Because Nick Courtney was due to go into Miss Saigon, and he didn't want to lose that. And ultimately, I mean, absolutely hats off to Nick Courtney. He sacrificed a leading role that would have been a long-running thing in Miss Saigon on the West End, purely to do Battlefield, bless him. But by then they'd rearranged the schedule anyway, so that's why Curse of Fenric is shot first, which is why it was freezing cold when they were shooting it, and it's boiling hot when they were shooting Battlefield, because they got them the wrong way around, production-wise. And of course, to me, the irony of this is that I think they would have been much better to start the season with the Curse of Fenric. I think it would have been a much, much better season opener than Battlefield. So as well as switching the production schedule, I think they should have switched the broadcast schedule as well.
I think in actuality, when you look at the finished pieces, I think that's probably true. I think Curse of Fenric is the stronger story. I can see why they went with Battlefield, because it got the Brigadier, it got this, it got more boxes ticked, but Curse of Fenric having the period setting, having things bolted down a little bit more. It'd been the first time that Doctor Who had gone to the Second World War. I can't imagine that, Jonathan, that they'd never been tempted, because by that point the BBC had made so many dramas set during the Second World War. What are your thoughts on the Curse of Fenric generally?
I love the Curse of Fenric. Yeah, it's one of my favourite stories, I think, out of all Doctor Who. I just think it's atmospheric, brilliant cast. Again, I mean, there are some issues.
But that's a big cast, isn't it? But they've all got something. Yeah. They've all got something to do. It's not too big.
No, I don't think so. I think the fact that the actors are so great, and they're like Alfred Lynch and Dinsdale Landon. Those two in particular, really. I mean, Landon, I think, is really impressive, and just the lines he gets and the way he delivers them are really, really nice. We meet again, Time Lord. Yeah. He says it a bit better than that, but
he flips that switch as well as Derek Jacobi does in Utopia. I would say that again, even though there was no weight behind that character, we'd not seen Fenric before, but I remember being sort of genuinely scared by that moment, and yet all that's really happening is an old fella is standing up out of a wheelchair. Nothing else is going on.
Totally, that's just no special. Okay, some special effects, but really no, it was all down to the voice and. Just the acting, wasn't it? I still have a few little niggles with it, just as a piece of BBC drama. I think some of the bits with the girls and the vampire, the Haemivores, the girls that are the vampires. It's just a little bit. Simon, that face is what I'm sort of feeling.
I think you've been very delicate with that, Jonathan. But those two, bless them, Phyllis and Jean. That's the stuff that brings it yet again. Ironically, brings it back down to sort of children's BBC level. Okay. They would be perfect in a children's BBC show. They would be absolutely perfectly cast. But they don't. No, it doesn't hold. They don't work against the gravitas of people like Dinsdale Landon and Alfred Lynch. They just don't. And Nicholas Parsons. They just don't. They can't. Yeah, that's the embarrassing bit. Is the stuff when they turn into vampires.
Yes, exactly. But I think overall, if I'm looking at it as a whole, it's a really great story for me. And then the whole the ethics and things and the story and that they get into at the end of it about. It's just the whole thing that's going through that with love, the word love, and what they're planning to do with the Enigma, the machine. And it's just there's some really lovely moments in there.
It's very literate. It isn't as sprawling as Battlefield is. It's very, very sure of what it's trying to say. I think that's the big difference, and you can agree with it or not. You can think that Doctor Who isn't the place or not, but they carry it right the way through with conviction. I think that's the difference.
I think you're right there, actually, Dan. In many ways, Battlefield is very, very similar to the Curse of Fenric. It's almost the same story that they're telling in a way, and yet somehow they do it in such a focused, carefully controlled way, as you say, whereas Battlefield feels a little bit all over the shop and trying to make six extras in quite shoddy armour look like these interdimensional warriors that are going to obliterate the planet. Doesn't work. They don't pull it off. At the end of the day, the Curse of Fenric, to an extent, is kind of a classic Patrick Troughton story. It's this base under siege, and so by keeping it very, very focused in that manner, they hone it down, and as a result, it works. I think it's actually one of the most intelligent Doctor Who scripts of the entire 26-year run of Classic Who. You could write theses on the Curse of Fenric till the cows come home, and you still wouldn't have run out of ideas. If anything, my only criticism, and I agree with Jonathan, the atmosphere is great, casting is great, The effects are great. Everything is brilliant in The Curse of Fenric. My only complaint, again, is it feels like it just needed a slightly tighter script edit just to pull some of those really random threads into sharp focus. So whilst the production is focused, the script still feels just a little bit too scattershot, really. I just wanted it clarifying who are the Haemovores. It's only on the viewing now that I've discovered that the Haemovores are actually from the future. I didn't get that previously. So I just think a little bit of a tighter script edit would have just really brought it into focus, and it would be one of the absolute greatest Doctor Who stories of all time, rather than a very, very, very good Doctor Who story.
So you're really glad to have revisited this one after such a long period, then? I
am, actually. I mean, maybe it's because specifically the version I've watched of this one this time from the box set is the extended version, the full length, the feature length version with about, I think there's about 20 minutes of extra material put in.
Yeah, because there's several options for both this and Battlefield in this set, aren't there? Several ways you can watch it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the one I watched as well.
The feature-length version one. And it works brilliantly. As a feature-length film, it does work absolutely brilliantly. So I can't help thinking, and again, Andrew Cartmel has gone on record as saying that they desperately regretted it being cut down to the 4 parts simply because there was so much material there, and they knew they were losing some of the story threads because of that. So the criticism I'm making, I think, was very much came about because of the fact that there was so much material there that you couldn't quite wrestle it down into a 4-part story, as has been proven ultimately.
And you being a big fan of John Carpenter, you must have recognised the fog.
Well, of course, it is a remake of The Fog, isn't it? But I'm not. That's by no means a criticism at all, because the Brain of Morbius is a remake of Frankenstein, so on and so forth. You can, a lot of the greatest Doctor Who stories are remakes or reimagines or pastiches, and so The Curse of Fenric is a remake of The Fog. Nothing wrong with that.
One thing that struck me about it as well, something I've only learnt quite recently, actually, and this is a little bit embarrassing, Jonathan. Alan Turing, I had no idea who really Alan Turing was until quite recently. And apparently the character of Dr. Judson is heavily based on the character of Alan Turing. The whole setup, really, of the Enigma machine, very similar to the real life happenings between Alan Turing and the people he's working alongside with and people in his life. And some of the subtext, which I gather is there fully in the book, and that we get some of in the screen version, that Judson and Commander Millington, had been in a relationship in the past, and all this sort of thing. These things, I forget about them in between viewings, because like I say, I didn't know anything about Turing until quite recently. And it struck me how if they made this story now, if they made The Curse of Fenric now, they would actually make Judson, they would make him Alan Turing, and he'd be their famous historical figure of the week.
Yeah, he would, yeah.
Because it doesn't cheapen them in any way, does it?
Oh, sorry, do you mean if they brought Alan Turing in?
Yeah.
Do you mean? Oh, no, I mean, that would be, I think it's actually long overdue. I'm surprised they haven't done that in the new series. There's so many things to explore.
And of course, the irony of it is, if they were to make The Curse of Fenric now, they absolutely would make explicit the relationship between Judson and Millington, and it would be. I was going to say it would be rammed down your throat. I'm going to change that just slightly and say it would be pushed to the fore. The relationship would be pushed to the fore. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just interesting to see how in those 30 years times have changed, and how you, in the same way, the survival would be all about lesbianism if they were to remake it today now. It just would. So it's interesting how times have changed.
Looking across to the 3-part stories that make up the rest of the season, Ghostlight, Jonathan. Now, Simon and I have discussed this a few times already on the video content that we make, where we sort of picked away at this, and our viewers and listeners have been kind enough to sort of chip in with comments to tell us all what this all means, and to put us both on track, because Simon, you've always held your hands up. You didn't understand this story, did you? I thought I did. Turns out I didn't. But I was wondering, what's your take on Ghostlight 30 years on, and do you have many memories of watching it at the time?
I do. I think at the time I was probably a bit confused by it all, yes. Now I understand a bit more about it. I mean, I get that it was this survey that that was taking place, and it all kind of went wrong because evolution kicked in and things like that. So I get the basics, but no, at the time I was watching it going, who's this? What's that? Why is that happening? This is a bit confusing. The music's a bit too loud in places I can't quite hear what they're saying. That's a bit murky. I mean, I loved the look of it at the time, and even now, of course, you can't fault the look of that program. It's just it's gorgeous. But and again, go back to the actors. We were so lucky to get such amazing actors in there. Ian Hogg. I remember actually when Ian Hogg came to Edinburgh, which is where I stay, and he was here for the Fringe one year, and spotting him in the street and actually running after him in the street just to stop him and say, "I loved you in Ghostlight. Thank you for being in that." And he looked a bit bemused by that. And Nicholas Parsons, actually, I stopped him once and got him to sign my DVD. But no, it's the atmosphere. Again, go back to sort of atmosphere. They do an amazing job with it. But they had just so much well, I suppose this is a theme here, isn't it? They had so many ideas, so much going on, and they were trying to cram into these episodes. And the viewers have left a bit like, but what's happening now? Oh, we've moved on to this. And yeah, so it's
better
another
to have
one.
too many ideas than not enough.
It is. At least I don't think you could call it boring. I was never bored with it. And watching it now, I just appreciate it more. And it is nice to sort of understand, I guess, just being older and also having read so much about it as well. I think that helps. If we'd had the commentaries back in 1989, maybe that would have helped us all. But
it's very League of Gentlemen, isn't it? The dark humour. This has got to be Mark Gatiss. He's got to love this.
The cream of Scotland Yard is still just one of the best lines, I think.
The Reverend Wainwright, when he gets turned into a ape, doesn't he? Because he's the guy who's against evolution. What do they call it? Darwinism. That's it.
Yeah, and it's just not... I think if you showed someone now who was not a Doctor Who fan, if you managed to get them to sit down and watch the show from 1989, I'm not even sure they would believe this was Doctor Who. Even now, it still doesn't quite feel like Doctor Who. It's this... it was what Doctor Who was evolving, I suppose, if we're sticking with that theme. It was evolving into something a bit more adult, perhaps, although we keep saying it. Of course, it had these 1 foot in the sort of children's department almost.
That's the anachronism, isn't it? Because if somebody had been channel hopping from Coronation Street or somewhere else and had sort of caught sight of this on BBC One, they would probably think it was a costume drama at first glance. The Doctor himself, he takes the Panama hat off at that point, hangs up the question mark umbrella, and he's moving around the house just the same as everybody else. He's making himself comfortable, sinking into armchairs and stuff. There's no running around. I don't think there's even any Nitro 9 in Ghostlight. Both of the main characters really sort of sink into it and scuttle around with everybody else. I think it's quite beautiful for that. I've always liked Ghostlight, even though I've sort of come in and out of understanding with it. But I'm sympathetic to the people out there who describe it as just a load of old cobblers. I really am, because as much as script writing and story construction, it's a craft, a practice, and a trade. Although I appreciate that it's probably true that there's not a single line of dialogue in this wasted, that everything that the characters say to one another is crucial. I think it's the same as the dialogue we were talking about in Battlefield. It's the same principle. You miss a little bit of it, and you haven't got everything you need to knit the whole thing together. And yeah, you could say it was prescient in the way that it was Doctor Who for the rewatch era, where people would watch over and over and over again for the, whatever you want to call it, for the video age. Because knowing that fans like us, we were taping it, we were watching it over and over again. But on the night, I think it's a populist TV show. I think the same principle applies now. Populist entertainment show. If it doesn't work on the night, then it doesn't work. The fact is that as human beings, as people who listen to this show know only too well, as human beings, we waste dialogue all the time. We say, certainly not everything that I say is important. I waffle on to my heart's content. And I think so should characters in TV drama, even in populist drama and even in genre fiction. Otherwise, they don't seem quite real. Okay, Doctor Who's a fantasy show. It's hyper real. But you've still got to be able to relate to the people that you're seeing talking. Otherwise, they don't seem like real characters, do they, Simon?
I think you're right with all of that. I mean, what's interesting, as you say, Dan, I have gone on record before now as saying I absolutely hated Ghostlight. on first viewing, I couldn't stand it. Now, what was interesting is way back last year, Justin Thomas, one of our faithful viewers, did actually send, if you may remember this, Dan, he did actually send an explanation for me, and I said I promised that I would read this explanation prior to watching Ghostlight again, and I did. I absolutely did. I still have the explanation in front of me, and it is, as Jonathan explains, it made so much more sense to me from the point of view of, yeah, okay, I now get it, which I didn't get it before. It's a survey. I can't believe that I didn't realise that control is the control of the experiment. Duh! How could I not realise that? What I didn't get was that Josiah Smith is the survey units that supposedly goes out. So I think there's an enormous amount that is still left very, very muddy. So I get Justin Thomas explained this perfectly for me, that it was this survey going on. Light got very frustrated because it did not couldn't cope with the changes that were constantly messing up his survey, and so just kind of went mad. I get that. I actually still hold this up and say, no, I'm sorry, it still doesn't make any sense. Who is Redvers Ben Cooper? Where did he come from? Why is he in the house? Why is Light even trying to do this survey? And if he was trying to do a survey, it's fairly obvious that it still wouldn't make sense. And so he would know that it doesn't hang together. It still doesn't hang together. But, and this is an absolutely crucial but, this is the one story that I have really, really reevaluated. I couldn't stand Ghostlight. This is only my second time I've ever viewed it, was in this box set, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And I think I've come to a realization that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't make sense, because Jonathan's right. It's the atmosphere. You're right, Dan. It's the dialogue. That dialogue it's poetical. It's literally dripping with meaning that you might not even understand, but it doesn't matter. I love the romantic poets. I love Shelley, I love Blake. Their poems don't make any sense, but it doesn't matter, because you get caught up in just the atmosphere of them, and the fact that, as Jonathan says, it looks beautiful, it looks magnificent. It's one of the most beautiful Doctor Who stories I've ever seen. And so I've completely changed my view. It doesn't matter that it doesn't make sense. Just watch it for what it is, which is just this magnificent, beautifully performed. Again, I didn't appreciate Ian Hogg's performance in it on first viewing. I'll watch it again now, and I literally just want more Ian Hogg. I could watch 2 hours of Ian Hogg being Josiah Smith now. And this is an enormous turnaround for me, so I can't be enthusiastic enough about how it's the one story of all of them in this box set that I just want to go back and rewatch again now. Not because I want to understand it.
I can't believe this. This is great.
Just because I just want to watch. I want to watch it again. I want to watch the atmosphere. I love the sets are beautiful. The performances are beautiful. I love the music, even though it is too loud in places. It's magnificent music. I've shocked you now, Dan.
This was Mark Ayres, wasn't it? This was Mark Ayres' music to this,
and Mark Ayres actually complains. He holds this up as a complaint. He complains that the music was too loud. He's not happy with the final mix on the show, which is very magnanimous of Mark to say so.
Everybody involved in this season, it seems pretty self-facing about what works and what doesn't, and maybe to a fault, I don't know. I've always liked the fact that there's a Douglas Adams quote in there that always goes some way with me, Jonathan. I've got to be. It doesn't take much more than that to get on my good side. I'm also a big fan of the song that Gwendolyn sings on the piano, That's the Way to the Zoo, which I gather is a real song. It had been written in the Victorian era at some point. I don't know, but that's always freaked me out a little bit. Ace eats kedgeree in that. No idea what kedgeree was then. I've still not got a clue. And you know what? I don't ever want to know. It sounds foul. What else is on? Yeah, Mark Platt, obviously he wrote that, didn't he? And he was only the second writer in the history of the show to identify as a fan after Andrew Smith. I think he'd been trying to get in with the production team since he was about 12, something like that. He was like blanket. Mark Platt now is a fine writer. I enjoy virtually everything that he does, particularly on audio, the Silver Turk and all this sort of thing. It's wonderful stuff. I think that as a first sort of stab at it, I've no doubt that Mark Platt would have come back had Doctor Who continued. He's the one writer that clearly, this was only the very, very beginning of what he'd got to give to the show. You could say that there's Robert Holmes sort of strings in there a little. There was no double acts as such, but it was vivid in that sense. And all the little things that I don't like about it, I'm sure they could have been evolved as he, as a writer, would have evolved, whoever he'd been working alongside. I don't know.
Did either of you ever read Lung Barrel?
Yes, I did.
Because that's obviously what they started as.
I found that virtually unreadable, I've got to be honest, but I did read it. And,
same here.
The
looms that they were growing and things.
Yeah, you can say you're right, Jonathan. Yes, that was the original. That was what was Ghostlight was going to be, wasn't it? And apparently JNT pulls the plug on that one because he said it's too impenetrable for mainstream viewers.
It's funny how you can persevere with something when you really want to, and I did. I pushed my way through that book in a way that I don't think I ever had before, and probably haven't. I probably haven't since. As a story, I mean, I always look forward to. I always enjoy watching Ghostlight. I think, and it is mainly because the set of Gabriel Chase. I think there are some beautiful moments in there when Ace and the Doctor have this sort of head-to-head, and we get that in the new series now. We used to all the time, particularly between the 12th Doctor and Clara. Lots of moments where there would be conflict like that. But I think this is the first time I remember having seen it. I mean, as much as I liked Tegan and the 5th Doctor having little sort of spats between themselves, it was just bickering, really. This was real beef that Ace had got with the Doctor. They pitched it really well, and in that setting, and the fact that it was Perivale all that time ago. I'm so glad you've come round on Ghostlight, Simon, because although it's not my favourite story by a long chalk, I've always appreciated a great deal of it. A story that does always grow in my affections every single time I watch it is Survival. And I think that's for a number of reasons. I think for a time, after it was broadcast, I didn't really rewatch it very much. I would deliberately not rewatch it. As time went on and it sort of sank in that Doctor Who wasn't coming back and that this was the last story, I think it had got an air about it that I kind of didn't go back to it because I didn't want to accept that the series was gone, it was over. Now, of course, I haven't got that problem. I can watch it with fresher eyes and appreciate it more so for what it is. I don't think there's another Doctor Who story like it. And although you could say, I think there's a strong argument to say that Russell T Davies involuntarily took some of that forward into his reinvention of Doctor Who. I think it's perhaps being overstated a little. All of drama had changed in the meantime, but it's a really significant piece of Doctor Who. Ghostlight was filmed last, wasn't it? Survival wasn't, and yet it seems right. I think if the season had have finished with Ghostlight, it wouldn't seem so formed, and that arc wouldn't work so well. The arc that we were speaking of, that's written by Scott as well, isn't it?
Yes, and I should say another little connection again. I'm blessed living in Edinburgh because we obviously have the Fringe here. So a lot of these actors end up coming to town. But I did go and see one of Rona's plays at the Traverse Theatre here a few years ago, and I was slightly embarrassed. I thought, should I go up to her and mention Doctor Who? Because this was maybe, let's say, 10 years ago, and I wasn't quite sure how she would take to this. And I went
she's
in
been phenomenally successful since, hasn't she?
She's one of Scotland's and the UK's, of course, is biggest and best playwrights, I think it's fair to say. But anyway, I thought I'll corner her in the cafe, and I said, look, I love your Doctor Who. And she was so excited about me saying this, and she was so happy that someone came up to her. And she just said how much she loved doing it and how much she appreciated John Nathan Turner giving her this chance and how lovely he was to her. And so that was nice to hear. And I, when I said to her I loved the story, that was true, because I think it's just, I sound like a broken record here, but that's another one that I just think is a great story. And just the fact that it was the streets of Britain in 1989 and we were living in 1989 in streets. We could look out the window and almost see what was happening without the killer cats and things. But no, that was a really special thing for me at the time, not an alien planet. And I really appreciate that from this season.
Contemporary Earth. Well, the last time we'd been to Contemporary Earth on Doctor Who was for Silver Nemesis. The version that we saw supposedly in Windsor of 1988 there was a world away from this. This does feel really, really authentic. It's also the street corners in broad daylight. They seem so spooky as well. And it would have been so easy for this to look like children's TV, in the same way that you quite rightly said that Battlefield does, Simon, simply because of the fact it was filmed outside on street corners. The direction, who directed this one? This was Alan Waring as well, wasn't it? And I think it's the way. I think it is all on the page. I think it's. I don't know how old Rona would have been when she wrote that, but her voice is so distinctive, so different from I think anything that we'd had on Doctor Who at that point. Probably in the best part of 10 years. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the story has got its faults, its flaws. Whatever, this is her first script doing it, and she was young, and we've got all the other culture there on Doctor Who at the time. But my God, I mean, it felt stark at the time. It felt distinctive. It felt new. And I think that's even more so now. I think it's aged really, really well, because it seems to exist in this bubble, this isolation, both in the series history itself and within the fiction. There's just enough characters to keep it all moving along. And there is allegory in this, and you could say that the message is hammered home. I think the performances don't hammer it home. I think they're still subtle when they need to be. I think it's been reappraised by everybody ever since. I've never met Rona Munro, but I did meet Eddie Kidd, who did the stunt bike work in this.
Oh yeah,
not quite the same. I know. Yeah, I didn't mention it to him actually. In fact, I might not have even known it was him. I don't know. He was. But
I can remember. I was 13, I think. Sort of get my years right. I think I was about 13 when this was on. But I can remember walking down the street and wishing a police box would appear or be sitting on a street corner. I lived in a little village in the Highlands at that point, so we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't have police boxes there, but I always remember walking, and it was, what was that, sort of November time, I think, October, I can't remember now the exact month, but it was cold, and just walking down the street and thinking, what if under that street light? So just to see this police box landing on a street corner was, for me, it was even more magical than seeing it landing on an alien planet, I think. So there's definitely, for me, there's just a little bit of remembering the past, remembering the past, I suppose, and my past and what was in my head at the time, which I guess must be the same with all these. Our memories of all Doctor Who and is tied in with our youth. And you talked about something about the understated side of it, or part of it, and the Master, I think, Anthony Ainley as well. Mm-hmm. Watching him again, and just that so different to what we've seen him before.
Do either of you know if this was another example of Rona being given the famous J&T shopping list, where she may have been told that she had to include the Master?
I don't actually know. I'm guessing it was a J&T shopping list. I'm guessing that I don't think Rona Munro is the kind of writer that would have come along in a kind of a fanish kind of way and said, I want to do a story about the Master. I think it's far more likely to be the other way around.
And yet it's so successful, isn't it, how she uses the character?
Well, oddly and ironically, considering it's A, the last Doctor Who story of the classic run, and also B, the last time we see the Master played by Anthony Ainley, at least on television, and it's probably the greatest Anthony Ainley story that he was in, and it's probably the greatest Anthony Ainley performance that he ever did. And I love Anthony Ainley as the Master. But he absolutely hit the pinnacle with this, but partially that is down to the script. And it's interesting because we've sort of talked about, with the other three stories in the season, as being sort of very rambling, maybe slightly unfocused scripts. And there's nothing unfocused about Survival. Yeah. And also, it's the most understandable, it's the most straightforward, but not in a boring way. Not in a predictable way, but it's the most straightforward, understandable of all of the stories from that season. It's the most assured. She knows what she wants to say, and she says it, and she says it brilliantly. And what I always think that I find particularly poignant, actually, with Survival, is that although this was not known at the time, because firstly they didn't know it was going to be the final story of the entire run, but actually that it wasn't going to be the final story of the season either. It was going to be Ghostlight would close the season, and then again they switched it around. So what I find particularly poignant in all of this is that, as you guys have quite rightly identified, this takes place in contemporary Earth for its largest part. And to me, as a result, it's this beautiful bookend between an unearthly child at the very, very beginning, which starts on contemporary Earth with a TARDIS in a very, very recognisable Earth-based setting, and we end exactly where we left off. Earth in that very first story episode in 1963. In a way, it's just beautifully bookends this entire run by the TARDIS back where it belongs on contemporary Earth. And I just think, although it wasn't planned, it's serendipity. It just beautifully bookends it and finishes the classic run, let's be honest, as best as it possibly could have ended.
I think so. And I think Rona's view of the show and the character is really, really clear. I think she knows exactly who the Doctor is, what he represents, what his place in the fiction is, and what the show's place in popular culture is. And in this story, they even restate it. It's what you were talking about a moment ago there, Simon, because they both refer to the TARDIS as home, don't they? Not Perivale, not Gallifrey. The TARDIS is now home. And the fact that when the Doctor and the Master are on the planet of the Cheetah people, and he immediately sort of, when they get into the fight, into the struggle, the fight for survival, the fight for life, that's where he ends up sort of teleporting back to. There's very little dialogue, but in focusing on these elements to the Doctor's character, particularly in part 3 and what makes him tick, I think Rona Munro manages to sort of to take the character back, to restate who he actually is, the power of the Doctor as a character, to restate that original origin, rather than doing something radical that Andrew Cartmel was flirting with the idea of doing, of reinventing the Doctor's backstory, and that somebody else has very foolishly now gone all in on. Rona Munro knew not to do that, and she knew that all you really had to do was to confidently reposition the character, and that the power was still there, to reframe it rather than to reinvent it. And I think that's why, God, can you imagine if Rona Munro had showrun this programme in the 90s or even now? I can't help but feel that way. I've always liked Survival. I thought it brought out probably the best in Sylve, certainly the best in Anthony Ainley. I think this is the master that he'd always wanted to play. I think this is a master worthy of Delgado, again on the page and in the performance, because Anthony Ainley was always a great actor. It sort of redeems the character a little after playing second fiddle quite a lot. Just
that idea that just because somebody is clearly mad, I mean, let's not get into, I'm no doctor, but I don't think just because someone is clearly got psychological problems, and let's put it that way, rather than saying someone's mad, that they're always just hyper and always screaming and shouting like we do these days in Doctor Who. And the idea that there were demons in there that he had to deal with, and he was just this, clearly crazy character, but keeping it. It was a lovely performance, and I wish the Master was kind of like that now. To be honest, it's much more effective, I think, than just seeing someone running about like a cartoon character.
There's a scene where he's in the flat with the little girl. It's played by Adele Silver, isn't she, the little girl in that? And he's like stood against a hearth, like in a normal council flat, and he looks in the mirror and looks at himself, and I think he closes his eyes and says, I must keep control, and really reflects, and you can see him mustering. It's really, really good stuff. This is Doctor Who that I can rewatch over and over and over again. I love it. Having said that, I mean, anybody, again, if we're talking about the channel hopper coming across this, I'm not sure what they would have thought. Is this Doctor Who? What are they trying to say? You have got that whole sort of lesbian plot that people talk about a lot more now. That went past me at the time. I think it's
past all of us at the time.
Yeah. I think Elisa Bauman's great in that. Sophie Aldridge terrific in it. I love the direction. I love the music. We had Dominic Glynn on the show quite recently, Jonathan, and he was talking about his music. Obviously, that was his score. I think the contrast between the Planet of the Cheetah People and contemporary Earth, that sells it even more. I think it's perfect at 3 parts. I don't wish this to be longer or shorter. There are silly aspects, but I don't. There are silly aspects in most classic Doctor Who, so I can't be too churlish about that, and I think that it does go out on, if not a high, then certainly on a positive. And the fact is that although Doctor Who was being confident about its place in TV and knowing its identity more than it had done for a while, the fact is that with the density of some of these stories that we've already spoken of and the themes, the harsher truth is it probably was outgrowing the format. It was outgrowing the budget, and it had certainly outgrown the level of either of the commitment that the BBC were ever going to bring to it. They weren't getting behind it, were they? I remember there was one single trailer for this entire season at the time. I felt deeply affronted by on a personal level, gentlemen. I have to, because you feel these things. I thought it was deliberately, specifically against me. Whilst it was a crying shame that regular Doctor Who did end at this point, I do think if it had have carried on, what indignities could the BBC have forced on it next? Because they clearly couldn't recognise a lot of the things that we had, that it had turned a corner, that which it was doing largely well, or certainly better every time it came back for another stretch of 14. Time for a quick break now. Just a couple of minutes, everybody, to let you in on some of the other little secrets of the Fandom Podcast Network and all those fantastic conversations going on all those other podcasts. Whichever corner of geek culture that you may dwell in the most. Here's a few words about all of that. Then meet Jonathan, Simon and myself back here again, camped out in 1989.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. We like to continue to feed your ears by inviting you to listen to the Fandom Podcast Network and all of the other awesome shows we have to offer. It starts with our flagship show, Culture Clash, our weekly pop culture news podcast. Bloody Kings, our Highlander podcast. Couch Potato Theater, our podcast celebrating our favorite movies. Time Warp, the Fandom Flashback podcast discussing a year in movies and our favorite pop culture topics. End Zone, the NFL podcast. Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast. Union Federation, our Star Trek and Orville podcast. Hair Metal, the 80s and early 90s rock metal podcast. Type 40, our Doctor Who podcast. Lethal Mullet, a 1980s and 90s action film podcast. What a Piece of Junk, a Star Wars podcast. And our newest show, Making Treks, a new Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier with host Mark Newbold and Adam P. O'Brien. You can enjoy all of these great Fandom Podcast Network shows on our master feed at fpnet.podbean.com. Fandom Podcast Network is also on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can also find us on Facebook under Fandom Podcast Network. You can also email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter under Fandom Podcast Network. Thank you for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
Something for everybody and some seriously great listens. And when you find your next favourite podcast and you want to tell the world or even tell the universe, we've even got some merch to match. A few clicks away at the tpublic.com store, there's a whole storefront. It pops up if you search for the Fandom Podcast Network, and you'll see right away it's loaded with all those logos on t-shirts, hats, mugs, tapestries, you name it. Add to cart, add to your life, and support the Fandom Podcast Network into the bargain. That way everybody wins. Shh. The only thing that they don't do over on the tpublic.com store, Simon, are patches. Just imagine Ace's bomber jacket, maybe with a Fandom Podcast Network logo on, or the Type 40 sort of emblem. That'd be quite cool. I have to think about doing that. Yeah. I can't remember what I was wearing back then. Oh, actually, no, I can.
It's probably best not to, actually.
We'll gloss over that. It wasn't good. I was desperately behind the times. I really was. But I do remember, because I was never out of the video shop at this time, or the cinema. We'd been rationed, I suppose you could say, to a 2-screen cinema in my area for years. Then the multiplex opens with 10 screens. So I started going to the cinema more and more and more and more, seeing whatever they would let me in for. Basically, I would pay in. But yeah, so I thought we'd take a quick look at some of the other films that were out in the autumn of 1989. This was what was competing with Doctor Who for our attention. Ridley Scott's police thriller Black Rain was out, with Michael Douglas as an NYPD officer who was escorting a Japanese gangster back home. You ever seen that one, Simon?
Oh, it's one of my favourites. Ridley Scott is one of my favourite directors. Love Black Rain. It's a little bit too long. It could be edited down a bit, but it's got a beautiful score as well. It's a magnificent piece of work. Love Black Rain.
I've been meaning to go back to it because I think over the years my appreciation of Ridley Scott has really, really grown.
He's a genius. The guy is an absolute genius.
I try not to throw words like genius around, Jonathan, but you can't help it with some, can you?
Yeah, and that's a film I have not seen, although it was on Now TV. I had the anyway, I missed it. It was
I recommend it. Go check it next time.
It'll pop up somewhere. That's the beauty of the modern age, isn't it? Yeah. There was a whole new era kicking off for Disney around this time. The Little Mermaid was released. This was their biggest critical and commercial hit in the best part of 20 years, I think. And an integral part of that was the beginning of their partnership with Alan Menken, who was a Broadway figure, I believe. He came in and created the score for The Little Mermaid and continued to work with them on things like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin as time went on. So The Little Mermaid, it's not a film that was particularly on my radar at that time. I just discovered pubs. But I do like some of the later stuff, and it was certainly a big benchmark for any Disney fan listening out there. Also on the cute scale was the Talking Baby movie, Look Who's Talking, with John Travolta and Kirstie Alley, with the voice of Bruce Willis in there. Charming little film. They probably ruined that by making a couple of sequels to it, wouldn't you say?
It was good at the time, but as you say, Look Who's Talking 2, and I think Look Who's Talking Now, was that with the dog or something?
I guess there was a dog, yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah, it's not good, is it? The future master himself, Eric Roberts, he was starring with James Earl Jones in a martial arts film called Best of the Best. The action movie bubble was kind of bursting a little bit at that point, I think. I found that rather soulless, even though it was the kind of thing I was into at the time. It didn't really work for me. You forget how big a star Eric Roberts was about to become, and it all seemed to sort of go a little bit south for him. But I do like him in lots of films. Maybe I'll go back to Best of the Best, Simon. What do you think? Give that another go.
No, I think I'll steer clear of that one. I think any film that calls itself the best of the best, is going to be just about the furthest thing away from it.
But on the other hand, we do have the biggest geek classic of 1989. I love this. I think you probably do too. Back to the Future 2 came out not long after Survival was on. That, of course, reunited most of the cast of that original film. We'd been waiting for about 4 or 5 years at that point. Catapulted Marty and Doc into the future to 2015. Just imagine. Hugely significant pop culture film in its own right. It gave us conference video calls, didn't it? And self-fastening trainers and the hoverboards and all that. I go back to this one over and over again. Just as good as the first one, in my opinion. What are your thoughts about Back to the Future 2, Jonathan? Do you like that one?
I love Back to the Future 2. Yeah, I love the Back to the Future films. In 2015, they had Back to the Future Day, and I was in LA when that was happening. I went to this great event. They had the various cars, the police cars from the future, and all these things. This little town somewhere near Los Angeles. It was brilliant, great fun. And I managed to get the New York. What's the paper that has that changes in the front with the dock in the front? Yeah. I got that as well. No, it wasn't the dock. It was when Marty, I think, is there. Anyway, I got some replica newspaper. But no, I love that film. And in fact, all three of them, they showed, I think, the third film in the open that night. And I love the third film as well.
So do I.
I'm just a sucker for Back to the Future.
They're good films, and they're brilliant. They're the best films I know as a drinking game, because you just split between every time anybody says Doc or anybody says Marty. Literally, it's the best drinking game out there, just purely on Doc and Marty. Go and have a fun drinking game during lockdown.
I'd be flat on my back after about 10 minutes in.
You would. You hear Doc and Marty literally hundreds of times throughout those three films.
Was part of 3, was that the next year that came out? Was that 1990?
Yeah, because they made them back to back, didn't they? They did 2 and 3 back to back.
I think it came out in the summer of 1990.
I remember seeing that in the summer, because I was in 1989. I said I was living in the Highlands. I was from Edinburgh originally, but we moved north, and this little place called Galsby, which is in the middle of nowhere. So going to the cinema was a real treat, because we had to go to Inverness, which was like hours away. So I remember seeing Back to the Future in Aberdeen, of all places. We went on holiday there for a little break. And anyway, the thing that still stands out to me after all these years is at the end of Back to the Future 2, the trailer for Back to the Future 3 being right at the end of it. And just my mind being blown, I think, by thinking, how can you have a trailer for the next one straight away? That's crazy.
They've got it already. It was all in the bag. They've got it already to screen.
And I hope they do that with Mission Impossible 7 whenever that comes out in the next few years, because they're filming 2 back to back, 7 and 8,
both with the same director as well.
Yeah, Christopher McQuarrie. So the idea that they might have a trailer right at the end of part 7, there's something quite exciting about that for me.
I remember seeing that trailer, and you know what? Every time I watch Back to the Future 2 now on DVD, I'll get the same rush from seeing that.
We need to do a Back to the Future podcast.
We do.
Absolutely.
You got me wanting to go watch it now. I think I need to watch that in the next few weeks.
It's always the same, isn't it? Around this time as well, we were having a revolution on British TV, and daytime TV had been in place for about 2 to 3 years at that point. We'd got satellite TV, had come in with Sky. All the original dishes, those massive dishes, were starting to appear on the sides of people's houses, and the BSB, the little squareals, the following year. So broadcasting was changing. There was no reason why Doctor Who couldn't change with it. I think it had changed before. It would have certainly have carried on and changed some more. But yeah, sadly, that wasn't really to be. That theme is something that's come back to continually in the special features for this season 26 box set. Here's a quick rundown of some of the features that are on this one. Starting off with Simon's favourite, Behind the Sofa. New episodes of Behind the Sofa with Sylvester McCoy, Sophie Aldred, plus extra sort of cutaways with Janet Fielding, Sarah Sutton, Aniki Wills, and the writers, the modern Doctor Who writers, Pete McTighe and Joy Wilkinson. We'll gloss over that one, Simon. We don't want to put you through it again.
Please don't. Please don't.
Showman is a feature-length documentary on the life and times of John Nathan Turner, of course the long-standing producer of Doctor Who, with contributions from Peter Davison, Colin Baker and various others. There's a brand new making-of documentary on the Curse of Fenric with Sylvester McCoy, Sophie Aldred and all the cast and crew, which features lots of behind-the-scenes footage and photographs and things. Even though the original Curse of Fenric was a 2-disc release, apparently it was quite light on actual features, which I'd forgotten that. There's the writer's room where Ben Aronovich, Mark Platt, Ian Briggs and Rona Munro get together with Andrew Cartmel to discuss their work on season 26 and maybe some of the things that we've been talking about now. I haven't watched any of this yet, so I've got all these joys to come. And there's another feature on Becoming the Destroyer, where the actor Marek Anton, who was underneath all those blue prosthetics, wasn't he? It all reminds me of the Tom Cruise Ridley Scott movie, fun enough, Legend. Reminds me of that character with the horns. But yeah, Marek Anton was underneath all that, and he's there with the prosthetics designer Stephen Mansfield. Sorry, I remember that just blowing me away at the time that Doctor Who could be capable of bringing that to the TV screen. It really, really did stand out. The big thing on this box set is Matthew Sweet's regular, what would you call it, interview, head-to-head. This time it's with Sophie Aldred in conversation for a full hour, because this is very much her season, so it just fits, doesn't it? And we get the Pete McTighe directed and written Ace Returns trailer too. That was about 3 minutes worth of brand new Ace. She may not say much, but she does just enough, doesn't she, to get their goose pimples going there. We see her back in character as Ace after all this time. Jonathan, once this box set dropped through your door, which features did you go straight for?
What did I go for? Behind the Sofa, I think, is amazing.
Brilliant! I'm so pleased. Are you being sarcastic, or are you being?
No, I'm being a bit sarcastic.
Oh, yeah. Are you? Oh, I was actually hoping for a moment that you might love it, and then.
No, I don't. I know. I mean, I've not heard your previous rants about Behind the Sofa. I don't want to trigger you again. They are slightly odd. I mean, I suppose I do watch them because I'm kind of interested to see.
Well, I watch them. Yeah, I do watch them. Yeah. But I'm afraid I do fast forward. I now fast forward through the Joy Wilkinson and the Pete McTighe bits. I'm sorry, but I do. Why am I listening to them talking about something they have no involvement with whatsoever? And Joy Wilkinson, bless her, she doesn't. I don't even know if she realised she's watching Doctor Who. What's the point? Sorry.
Oh, I know. Well, you see, the thing is with Pete McTighe, I've been watching. Did anyone watch? What's it called? Wentworth.
Yeah, we've spoken about Wentworth. You and I haven't we before now? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's fantastic telly, and Pete McTighe is one of the key forces involved with that. I'm a bit of a fan of Pete McTighe, I think, these days, and the fact that he adores this season, and he was involved in that Fenric documentary, which I didn't even realise was a new documentary until just last night when I was going through the extras and I started playing it, and it was all in HD. So, but the first thing I went to was actually the Sophie interview. And then I ended up watching Showman with a friend of mine, Ben Morris, who actually does some does some work for Doctor Who magazine. But
I know that name. He was an illustrator, wasn't he, Ben?
Yeah. We ended up watching
really
it.
Talented.
And anyway, that the Showman documentary, I remember watching a teaser of that on the Doctor Who magazine, had a giveaway. So I watched some of that. Anyway, I thought that was a really nice documentary. And of course, with all these things, you do start to think, what new is there to say about these shows? But I think with that, they actually did find some interesting, just nice to see the footage. And it's really bittersweet, isn't it, now, I think, watching John. And I think at the time we were all, well, I don't know about you, but I was certainly reading DWB, and The Hatchet was... It
was one-sided, wasn't it?
The sad thing with that whole fallout towards the end of the classic run between fandom and JNT is so sad, because the fans just didn't realise what John was trying to do, which was just keep the blasted thing on television. And he basically, let's not shy away from this. He sacrificed pretty much his entire future career purely to stay with Doctor Who. He wanted to leave. The BBC wouldn't let him leave and told him that if he left, the show would end. And so he sacrificed his career to stay with the show and keep it on the air. And so, as Jonathan says, it's very, very bittersweet now to realise the sacrifices he made, what he was trying to do. It was his job. It's not like we're all fans. We can say what we want to say and get away with it. It was his job. He's a professional. That was what he did. The guy was in an impossible situation.
It's just one of these strange but great things that as fans we learn more and more about the people involved in our favourite show every year. And there was that book that came out, of course, Richard Marsden's book, I think it was, a few years ago. We see these sides to people, and it all just, you just think, oh, why was I reading DWB at the time and thinking, oh, JNT must go. I feel bad. Sorry, John.
With your newfound love of Ghostlight, Simon, are you going to be heading to this extended work print to have a look at the...
I have watched the extended work print. To be honest, that was the version that I watched. I skipped the transmitted version completely and went straight for the extended work print. And I have to say, they do it really, really well. The quality of the inserted footage is remarkably good. I expected it to be quite poor quality footage, but it isn't, aside from the fact that they have to blot out the time code in a number of shots.
Because they did have a lot of extra footage for this originally, didn't they? And it was destroyed shortly after broadcast. So this is all that we've got, really, that's left.
It's all that we've got, yeah, is this time-coded copy of it. But as I say, if you haven't watched it yet, don't be put off by this, because the quality is really very, very good. You don't have a disastrous drop in quality. I mean, certainly one of the best features I thought on the box set was the new Curse of Fenric documentary by Pete McTighe. He does an absolutely cracking job with that. It's just a really solid documentary. The fact that they go to the original locations gives it so much gravitas. The documentary feels so legitimate, so valuable. The fact that they get Tom Eckborg back and Nicholas Parsons back, it's just a cracking 1 hour documentary. So I take my hat off to Pete for that. It's a really good job.
So I think I saw a recent reunion cast shot of the Curse of Fenric with all those actors back together at a convention somewhere, with, I think Sophie Aldred was there, Sylvester McCoy wasn't, but everybody else that was alive still was, and they all still seemed so friendly. It was really, really nice.
Well, apparently what I didn't know until I was watching this documentary is that apparently Sylvester, Sophie and Tomek kept in touch ever since the Curse of Fenric production and have been best buddies ever since, and they've kept in touch. They've kept socialising. I'm not sure where Tomek lives now. I'm assuming he's
Yugoslavian, wasn't he?
Polish.
Polish. I'm sorry. He's one.
I keep mentioning Edinburgh. He lived in Edinburgh for many years. I don't know if he still does, but he did until about 3 or 4 years ago. He ran a local
Did you manage to flag him down at some point?
Yeah, well, he ran a theatre. So I remember he would during the Fringe in particular. In fact, he had a theatre where Clive Swift had a show on. I remember going to see, again, as there's a theme here, trying to get him to sign my DVD. Yeah. And Clive made a very swift exit, actually.
Hey!
True to form, Clive.
He wasn't happy about being associated with that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really? Gosh,
well, he certainly wasn't when I met him. He maybe was just in a rush, but he was very much, okay. Whereas Nicholas was happy to chat.
We've only just lost Nicholas Parsons, haven't we? He's just passed away. Was he 96, something like that? Great loss.
I think so. And wasn't it amazing to see him
But it's brilliant seeing him in that documentary. It's just fantastic. You know, thank goodness that they did get him just before he died. Bless him. It's just beautiful to see him there. Probably my very favourite feature in the entire box set actually is the Sophie Aldred interview that you already mentioned, Jonathan. It's a cracking interview. It actually goes on for nearly an hour and a quarter, and it's a thoroughly riveting read. I learnt stuff in that. As Jonathan quite rightly says, you sometimes think, is there any more we can learn about this show that we don't? Can they come up with anything new? But actually, it does. This interview really does come up with new stuff. And Sophie talks very candidly about John Nathan Turner, for example, and the fact that she got the feeling he actually didn't like her for the first couple of years. Yeah. I never knew this stuff. This was all new to me. So I was fascinated. But what was an absolute thrill for me at the very end of the Sophie Aldred interview, and I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody that hasn't seen it, there's this lovely little coda where she talks about this moment at a Doctor Who convention where she nearly died. She nearly choked to death. And this was brilliant for me because I was there at the time. I remember this convention so clearly. And I won't spoil it for anybody that hasn't seen it. Go and watch the documentary. And watch this last sort of little 2-minute where and they've got the convention footage as well. It's in there. So if nothing else, go and watch that because it's brilliant. And as I say, for me, because I was there and watched it live on stage, watching her nearly die, it was fantastic to actually see this addressed in the documentary, in the interview, and to see the footage on there. It's a beautiful box set. You cannot fault this box set. It's fantastic.
Also, just going back to that Curse of Fenric documentary again, they have new unseen footage from when Sophie was about to jump into the water in 1989 or 8, whenever they filmed it.
Yeah, because that's quite a drop, isn't it? That's a really sheer drop off Maiden's Point, that one. And she insisted on doing these things herself as well, didn't she, a lot of the time, from what I've heard? Yeah,
absolutely. And also there's a photo in there I've heard they mention, we're spoiling it, I'm afraid, for people who have not seen this, but they do mention she had to dry out in one of the cafes. And there's a little photo, I think it's at the end of that documentary, where she's in the cafe with the towel in her head, holding a cup of tea, and you think, I can't believe we're getting to see this stuff. It's amazing. You were talking there about convention footage. I loved seeing the Panopticon 93 footage because I was there, and I keep thinking I must look at it and see if I can see myself in one of those. Yeah. That was one of those people I think that took, all those people standing up at the front taking photos forever, which was ridiculous. I think I was there at one point taking some photos. But no, it's just great seeing all these Panopticon videos popping up again. And
I think it's fantastic with these box sets. I agree with you. I love seeing the Panopticon stuff on there, and I'm very pleased that somehow they've managed to license it from whoever owns the copyright at the moment.
Because Andrew Beach, I think, isn't it?
Is it Andrew Beach still that owns that? Because I wouldn't necessarily have expected to see any of that footage on these Blu-rays at all because of the licensing issues, but they've clearly come to some agreement, and I'm delighted they have, because you're right, Jonathan. It really it makes all of these box sets feel very rich and complete, and that you are seeing stuff that you've never seen before, that you I certainly never thought I would see again. So it's great to see.
Nebula 90, I think it is, isn't it, on the Fenric?
The panel.
The panel from there, an hour-long documentary from there.
I can't wait to see that. Around this time, I was going to a fair few conventions, and I got to meet some of the cast, funnily enough. Frank Windsor from Ghostlight, I got to meet him, and James Ellis from Battlefield. They were sat together because they'd been in Zedgars together, hadn't they? So they were both on the outside of a lot of whiskey. By the time I got round there with my little paperback of Ghostlight for Frank Windsor to sign, and James Ellis signed something else for me, they were well on their way. But there were some big names in the guest caster. All these stories, even though Doctor Who was there, sat there in this graveyard time slot that we keep talking about, with an audience that was steady but had diminished. There's no two ways about it. They were still getting James Ellis, Frank Windsor, Sharon Deuce, Ian Hogg, we've mentioned, Dinsdale Landon, Anne Reid, Janet Henfrey from The Singing Detective. All these people were still queuing up, happy to be in Doctor Who and being brilliant in it. You could say the same about Hale and Pace. On one hand, that seems like stunt casting, but Hale and Pace, they play it straight too. They get it, they got it, they brought it at the time. Sadly for them, nobody remembers really Hale and Pace now, unless you're our age, do they? So to now when you watch that, they're just two guys in another episode of Doctor Who. Bless them. This stuff, 30 years after the fact, it's not lost on me that everybody involved in this is thoroughly excellent. And I think Nicholas Parsons in particular was a huge surprise then. And I can't say that I knew that performance was coming from him. I'd only ever known the game show host as well. Of course, now it's pretty much common knowledge, or it's sort of come back into being common knowledge, that Nicholas Parsons did this decades long as a jobbing actor before the game shows. So of course he was going to be good in The Curse of Fenric. I suppose the last sort of word on this, have to go to talking more about Sylvester and Sophie, the two regular cast members. They worked so hard in these parts over a long period of time. In fact, Sylvester McCoy, he wasn't the most natural fit for the Doctor. I've always said that they could have picked a lot better to play the part, but they could have picked considerably worse. That being said, I don't think anybody before or since has worked harder to get this character right, to connect with the role, and by 1989 he absolutely had. And that was due in some ways, I'm certain, to this close relationship, this collaborative relationship with Sophie Aldred. We would see Sylvester again, but never again for a full episode. And as a final shout for this TARDIS team, as we now call them, Jonathan, how do you feel about it as a Sylvester McCoy fan? Does this bring a lump to your throat when you get that speech at the end, when you see her giving back the Panama hat? How does that make you feel now when you see it again? It's still got power. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, every time I see that walk into the distance, into the bushes, I suppose, the trees. No, I definitely do get a slight lump in my throat. I think Sylvester's not. He's not a natural. He's not the best actor, but at the same time, I think what you said there about, I think he tries very hard, and I think he tries everything. He's game. He tries anger, and he does the light touches very nicely. I think when they arrive in Curse of Fenric, I think just the conversational stuff is really nice.
All of his choices are sound, aren't they? Everything.
Yeah, I think so. I think when he gets angry, he's maybe not so good at the extreme anger. That's maybe not Sylvester. But when they have him on a level, and he's just on a level playing field with Sophie, and the banter is nice, and the interactions are nice. So much as I've just said, he's not the best actor, I think he does very well as the Doctor. And I think that character then that spun off into the novels and the New Adventures, that the writers had a lot to work with, because he had tried so many different emotions in the series, and you'd seen him angry. And if you think about something that, much as I love Davison, for example, or Troughton, any of them really, maybe Troughton is the one I would have on right at the top. So for me, I don't want to say anything negative, but Davison, again, much as I love Davison, I don't even think he gets to do as much of a range of emotions as Sylvester tries and does. It does work a lot of the time, just not every time. Yeah. No, just watching this set, it brought a lot of memories back, and I want to watch more of the stuff on there, I think, and watch the stories again sooner rather than later.
Because this is your introduction to Doctor Who, wasn't it? This period, the Sylvester McCoy era.
Pretty much. As I say, I do remember watching some Colin Baker, but even that, I can remember it as maybe being 9 or 10, thinking the sort of Dayglow coat and some of the stuff that was happening, thinking, I'm not quite sure about this. And then for some reason, I think even the darker jacket this season really works, and the duffel coat. I hate that jumper, and I think Sylvester, I feel so sorry for him. I'm just looking at the box set cover just now, but I feel so sorry for him having to wear that jumper. But no, I think they were a great pair, and we were so lucky to have them at that point. And we could be here all day talking about what could have been next. And I know there's a documentary which I've not watched. I think it was on the original, one of the old DVDs, about what was going to happen next.
Well, Jonathan, you'll have to come back and talk to us some more about what could have been in season 27.
Yeah, that's another episode, isn't it?
Tempt you back with that, yeah. Simon, just to wrap things up here, as somebody who was at odds with the show at the time, you've been charmed a little by Ghostlight. The things that we say about the Seventh Doctor and Ace, this may not be your Doctor Who when your affection was at its most, but can you see why people hold those two characters in this partnership up as high as they do, and why it may be considered, if not in the same breadth as Sarah Jane and Tom Baker, it's certainly considered to be a classic combination that really works. How do you feel about it now?
No, absolutely, I agree. I mean, no, I wouldn't hold them in the same affection for me personally as, for example, Sarah Jane and the Fourth Doctor. But in all honesty, Sylvester and Sophie, the Seventh Doctor and Ace, are arguably certainly one of the strongest Doctor-companion relationships we have ever seen, if not the strongest. As hard as they try in the modern series to bludgeon us into believing that there is this connection between the fam, as we're supposed to call them now, they're not even coming close to the connection, that the chemistry that Sophie and Sylvester have, and the connection between the two characters themselves. To me, this is the model of what the modern series is trying to do and failing dismally to achieve. And so I would absolutely hold Sophie and Sylvester up as an absolute classic model of what the Doctor-companion relationship should be. And I have to be honest, having watched the whole of the season 26 box set through now, I have a renewed affection for it. I have watched it with fresh eyes from when I first saw it back in the late 80s, and I'm looking at it with much more affection now. Certainly much more appreciation. I can appreciate it much more, and I think Sylvester in particular, his performance is nothing if not interesting. That's what, and that to me is an absolute enormous plus point. It doesn't really matter to a large extent whether you're a good or a bad actor. If you can give an interesting performance, that's what I want to see. I don't necessarily need to see Laurence Olivier style acting. I need to see something that invigorates me and interests me, and I want to watch them further. I want to spend time with that person, and Sylvester does that in spades.
This is the thing with the Doctor. I think that the best classical actor in the world, it doesn't necessarily follow that they've made a good Doctor. They have to be a natural eccentric and be sort of willing to bring so much of themselves, which I think Sylvester absolutely did. So you'll be looking forward then to season 25, maybe giving that another look then, Simon, when that pops up.
I'm going to buy all of these box sets, and there's something to look for in all of them. You know, let's be honest. No Doctor Who is bad Doctor Who, at least in the classic years for me. And so I just want more of it. Just keep them coming.
Jonathan, what do you think will be the next release? We know season 14's coming. We haven't heard yet what's following directly after. What's your gut instinct telling you?
Well, what I would like to see is some more Pertwee.
Okay.
So I'm hoping we get a Pertwee season. I'd love to see Ambassadors actually on Blu Ray.
There are no wrong answers to this one, are there? There really aren't. Yeah, let's keep in mind, everybody, that this season 26, although it's been out for a few months now, like all of the titles in the Blu Ray collection, that they are limited editions and stock is dwindling all the time. Don't hold off if you want to pull the trigger. I'd probably do it sooner rather than later before those prices, they start to climb and you end up sort of clenching your fist, staring at a screen and thinking, why didn't I?
Not that you've ever done that, Dan.
oh dear, go back to those YouTube videos. Yeah, it is time for us to get scarce too now. I'll be back pretty soon with some more Type 40. You can look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been on Apple Podcasts if you search for the Fandom Podcast Network over there on Apple Podcasts, and leave us a review while you're there, just so new listeners can find us that bit easier. We're also on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Play, the Podbean app, and my very favourite, Spotify. Thank you for being so easy to use, even for me, Spotify. Anything you want to say to us, you can share your reviews of Series 26 and your memories of 1989 and the music and the movies and all the rest of it. Tell us if you think we've got it right, got it wrong, whatever. Get in touch, join the Facebook group, or you can email us at type40doctorwho@gmail.com, Twitter and Instagram at type40doctorwho, whatever else. Simon, what's the name of your domain on Facebook again?
Go back to Facebook and find me under the Hoonatics.
And your website again, Jonathan?
It's just jonathanmelville.co.uk.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us for this sort of romp through 1989, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure.
Good fun. Thanks for having me.
Jenny, we're going to have to invite you back, I'm afraid. And yeah, thanks.
Please do.
Chuckling in the site already. And thanks to you for listening. Join us again next time here on the Fandom Podcast Network for another episode of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast where we always have the time if you have the space.